Welcome to the RevRec Gals podcast, where two consultants with over 30 years combined experience share stories about the implementation and challenges of revenue recognition accounting. I'm Susan.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the RevRec Gals. Welcome to another episode of the RevRec Gals. So we've talked about transfer of control over time, which is the default. And if we determine it's not transferred over time, then it's transferred at a point in time. Natasha, would you like to talk about some of those indicators and then we can dig more into them?
If you don't meet the criteria to go over time, then you're looking at point in time recognition, which is just such a big distinction. And this conclusion is so important because it does have significant revenue impact. Some of the indicators of point in time, which can be helpful in this assessment. The things you can think about is there a present obligation to pay? Is the customer legally, contractually required to pay? Does the customer have physical possession? Is it in their warehouse, at their store, in their server? Do they have physical possession? Legal title. Contractually, how is the contract set up? Does title transfer at FOB shipping point, FOB delivery? We can get into that a little bit more, but legal title is certainly something you can usually find in the contract. And then my favorite, risk and of rewards of ownership. And I think this is where a lot of the gray comes in from my perspective. You know, it's a very subjective and it's kind of helpful because it has this high level perspective. What are the risks and rewards of ownership? And does the customer truly have that? And then lastly, accepted the asset. Have they actually accepted? And this, again, can play into how the contract's set up. There's particular acceptance terms, although the way acceptance plays into it is a little bit different than it used to be under the old guidance.
Let's start with the first one, present obligation to pay. And I guarantee, like everything else in ASC 606, you and I are going to go back and forth between all of these because they do play into each other. Present obligation to pay is, does the customer have to pay you for it? A lot of times I have to look at this when there's some free time added to a contract. You know, they bought 12 months and then they have another month. And is that month a free trial? Is it a free period? Is it just a free month? When you start that, do they have the obligation to pay? If it's a free trial and it's not until they decide, yes, I want a subscription, and they make that purchase decision that there's an obligation to pay, then you really haven't transferred your control because they haven't made up their mind yet. They're just testing the waters.
One of the other things I think that it's worth mentioning, because I think within the accounting literature, things can be taken literally. Present obligation to pay doesn't mean, you know, if there's net 30 terms, they don't have to pay for 25 more days. No, it's not just the passage of time.
Are they contractually obligated to pay?
Yeah. And how the events that the vendor or the provider needed to provide in order to trigger that payment happened. So like, has that happened? Have they delivered the thing they needed to deliver? Have they provided the action to trigger that invoicing so that you need to pay that money? And just because you have net 10, 20, 30, 60, 90-day payment terms doesn't change that. And so I just want to explicitly say that because I think it can be confusing sometimes. As accountants, we kind of look for the black and white. Wait, well, it's not due, so it can't be.
But on the flip side of that are prepayments. So the people give you the money. Just because they gave you the money doesn't mean you have the right to keep it. It's a deposit. Have you taken that action required to then contractually require them to pay you? And so until that action takes place, that is a deposit that could potentially be required to be repaid to the customer. So just because you have the cash on hand doesn't necessarily mean the revenue is recognized. You may have to wait for acceptance of the asset. You may have to wait for physical possession. You may have to wait for all these other things that are in here, even though you have that money.
So many of my clients are over time that the particulars around exactly when things start and when things end, not that they don't matter because they do, but if you're wrong, you're only wrong. Let's say if it's a 1-year term by, 1/365th of the revenue amount. For these at point in time revenue conclusions, it can be a big number and it really does matter how you think of these things, because it can shift a significant amount of revenue from one quarter to the next, from one year to the next, and have significant impacts on the qualitative ways that investors look at you. Did you meet earnings? Yes or no? Are you growing? Yes or no? And so it's really important that we think of these appropriately and consistently to make sure that timing is right. And that prepayment is such a good point, because yes, just because you have the cash does not mean you have provided what you needed to provide such that they're obligated to leave that money with you.
To your point, I see at the end of a month or end of a quarter, especially the end of a quarter, the auditors going out and confirming when that transfer of control has occurred. And in many cases, especially with a physical product, you go into that physical possession. Looking at those Incoterms you mentioned before, FOB destination, FOB origin, when does title transfer? That goes into legal title. When has it actually arrived at their site? They may have physical possession of it, but maybe they have a substantive acceptance clause, in which case, even though they have physical possession, title hasn't transferred yet. So they're really still in that acceptance mode. They may have even paid you, but just because they paid you and just because they have it physically doesn't mean they've accepted it or legal title is transferred.
And I think this goes back to a few things. One being, what does it say in the contract? I think that's always a good place to start. What do the words say in the contract? Then, what are the company's business practices? What does the company actually do in practice? And relatedly, what is the customer expecting? Which is based on the sales cycle, based on the business practices. If you have a customer that's been a customer for 5 years, and they always go through a rigorous acceptance criteria, and sometimes they reject things and return them and they get new ones, the customer is going to expect that that is what happens, regardless of what it says in the contract. Maybe it's not super explicit or spelled out in the contract. Maybe it looks sort of vague. But if that's the practice and that regularly happens, well, then you really need to be thinking about that. In contrast, you may have a contract that has acceptance terms, but basically they're perfunctory. Like no one ever really does anything or looks at anything. And it basically is just there because it looks nice. It doesn't mean much. Payment isn't tied to it. Maybe even title isn't tied to it. It's already in their physical possession.
It becomes more of a warranty in that situation.
Totally. It's almost in practice more of a warranty. And this is where different companies, different people use different words in different ways. Different industries use different words in different ways. And so you really have to get to substance of what's really going on here. Which brings us to risks and rewards of ownership. When I think of this, when I think of, risks and rewards of ownership, can you keep this asset safe? When you think of the risks, like risk of loss, where does that sit? And I think certainly in shipment, that's something that risk of loss can be at FOB shipping point or destination. And then ultimately the rewards of ownership, can you benefit from that? Can you sell it? Do you have the economic benefit of that particular asset or service or performance obligation? And if the customer has that benefit already with them, well, then that's a pretty good indication that they have received control of that particular performance obligation.
This one can be really challenging, especially when you have a third-party distributor or reseller. This is where the whole principal versus agent conversation also comes in, because with a reseller, you have to say, when do they take ownership? When do they get the risks and rewards of ownership? Or are they just an agent of our company? And especially I see this in the situation where they request a drop ship. So you've got hardware, the reseller has sold it to an end user, and they've asked the vendor to drop ship it. So normally with a reseller, they would actually take physical control and then pass it on to the end user. But in this case, they're bypassing that. And so have they taken that risk and reward of ownership? In which case, when do you actually recognize the revenue and how much? So now we're again talking about different steps of the guidance. One of the things I've seen is if you've determined that the reseller is a principal, they become your end user. And even though they've directed you where to send it, they still take on the risks and rewards. So they still take on the money from the end user. They take on the risk that the end user doesn't pay or that the end user has an issue. So then your risk and reward is with that reseller, even though you've shipped to the end user. So it's a really nuance to this whole risks and rewards of ownership.
That's a great point. Remember that concept of a step 6 I was talking about? That's where that principal versus agent sometimes comes in. I think of that also as part of step 1 because you're defining who your customer is. The other way that I think of this too is because sometimes it's not even a physical product. There's not even drop shipping. In the software and SaaS world, it's software keys or software licenses or just access. Here's your login. And so it becomes really, really tricky trying to figure out who is delivering what to who is the customer interacting with, who is the customer going to go to if they have a problem. Is it different for technical support versus a problem with the transaction? Like, who do they think of as being the person that they're buying from? Which is really tricky. And it can be very nuanced. And you see this a lot with marketplaces, like the Salesforce Marketplace, Google Marketplace, Apple. And then a lot of SaaS companies will have their own marketplace associated with that. Have you seen that a lot as well on the software side?
Software is a little bit more like a drop ship of a tangible product where has the email gone through and gone to the right email address and are your servers available if they wanted to access it?
SaaS is a little tricky because there's a continuous delivery, which is different. It's not like a one-time delivery.
That's the one thing of physical possession, even if it's software, can they actually access it? When you send that email and you tell them, here are your codes, you've given them the right. They may or may not exercise that right at 11:59 p.m., but you've given them that right. And you have to make sure it's available. So if your servers are down, and even though you've told them, you haven't delivered because they can't access it if they tried. So there's more than just this whole, we've given you what you need. Has everything else fallen in line as well?
Well, and I think that's interesting too, because there's this whole stand ready idea that they might still need something that the company has to provide, but it's dependent on the customer taking action. And just because the customer hasn't taken action, as long as the company has given them what they need to proceed and is standing ready to provide the last little nuance. Maybe once you log in, there's an automated email that then sends something. So it could be that email still hasn't quite happened, but the company's ready, everything's set up, it's ready to go. Just the customer needs to come in and do their part, which might not happen for a while. I'm that person that makes a purchase and then 2 months down there and I'm like, oh, right. How do I? It is a reality for a lot of companies.
Yeah, I have a client, they have technical support, and then they also have a subscription service. Technical support starts the day that the hardware title is transferred or delivered, whichever is the case. But then the subscription, they allow the customer like 2 months to actually install the product. And once that server pings, it starts the subscription. But if it doesn't ping, then it automatically starts after 2 months.
Interesting. And so the subscription term is different than the support term.
Right. But it's interesting that, they don't just have one single criteria. It's like, if this happens, then it's this date. And if not, then it's this other date. Because if you think about it, if you don't have that expiration date, that money could be sitting in your deferred forever. I've also seen customers where they'll sell training or they'll sell professional services on a per class or a per day basis. And if they don't have an expiration date, it could just sit out there until forever because the customer may forget that they have it or there's turnover and they never take those classes or use those professional services. So it's also something to think about when you're thinking about this transfer of control is if they don't do it, forcing that date.
Yeah. At what point do you just say it's over?
I have seen a company where they actually had quite a bit on the books because they didn't have this language in there. And I think they waited 2 or 3 years and did reach out to the client. And then after 2 or 3 years, they were able to just take the revenue. Also, in the scheme of their revenue, it was immaterial. I mean, it was still a large amount, but it was immaterial.
I see some form of that with a lot of companies because at the start, they're like, oh, great. As long as we can get people to sign the contract or give us the money or whatever, it's a good thing. It's a booking. The way that you're looking at success is different in those earlier stages. And then as you grow, it becomes more about revenue. And so having these things just sitting on deferred revenue just become a pain. And so it is worth thinking about having a backstop when you're structuring the contracts. It can save a lot of heartache down the road for a little amount of revenue.
I really think that right to use is so important, because think about any time you buy some software. Like you may buy Microsoft 365, but maybe you don't get a computer for 6 months. Well, they don't want to have to say, well, I have to wait till they get a computer and install it, because you may never buy one. You may forget. It goes in a drawer. It goes in your cabinet, whatever. They've already given it to you. And if you decide not to use it, that's your business. They've sold it. They've recognized revenue because there's no further obligation.
One thing I want to circle back to, going back to physical possession and physical products, because I know at least I tend to live in the world of software and SaaS, so I go intangible. But bill and hold transactions, I think, are another one that's worth mentioning here, where there could be a scenario where physical possession may still sit with the provider or the vendor, and control has transferred to the customer. And so you see these in bill and hold arrangements. You have to be really, really careful, because it's a simple way to push your revenue numbers up. Convince a whole bunch of customers to buy something and say, don't worry about it. You don't actually have to take it. We know you don't need it. We know you don't have space for it. We'll just hold it here, but we want to count it as revenue now. So it's in the contract. We're going to invoice you. It looks like revenue. So you really have to look at the details there of at what point does control transfer? At what point do the risk and rewards of ownership transfer? At what point does title transfer? Physical possession might not have happened yet. And this is why these are indicators, right? You have to use judgment here. Do they truly have an obligation to pay? What are the payment terms? Just because they invoiced it, I would be very skeptical if I see an invoice go out on December 27th for products that are being held until February and payment terms aren't due until April. Well, why? What's the substance of what's going on here? And has legal title and the risk and reward of those assets truly transferred? I haven't seen a lot of this firsthand. Is this something you've seen a lot of, Susan?
I have seen this, and it was an interesting nuance where the salespeople were getting very creative and said, well, what about if we ship it to this warehouse and the customer pays for storage? The caveat was the warehouse was owned by the vendor. Now, if the warehouse was owned by a third party, then they could potentially say, yes, the third party has selected this warehouse. We shipped it. We have no further obligation. But because the recommendation was their storage facility and the customer was going to have to pay additional, it was really questionable about whether this customer was really intending to take receipt of the goods that early. Because why would they want to do it in storage if they weren't ready for it? Or if they did, some people want to have supplies on hand, then it would be their decision to put it into storage, and it would be their decision where to put it.
I would imagine in like a drop shipping scenario, there could be what we talked about, they still have physical possession, but they no longer sort of directly use of particular inventory. Like if you have inventory that's being created for a particular customer and they're going to sell it, but it's being drop shipped, it's possible that that customer is directing the use of those assets. Have you ever seen anyone in a bill and hold or drop ship scenario be successful around it?
No, usually in that case, it's as they get shipped out, they would consider the title to transfer. Otherwise, you're just holding on behalf of the reseller. Unless, but this is where you have to look at all of the criteria. What's in the contract? Has the reseller committed and they're paying for it regardless of whether those get shipped out or when they get shipped out? Has legal title and the risks and rewards of ownership already transferred? Maybe there's a scenario where the reseller says, yeah, we agree. We own that. We just don't want to ship it to our warehouse, or we don't have a warehouse. It's really nuanced.
I would imagine if it was custom, if it has a logo all over it, or, they can't use it for anything else, maybe they already paid for it up front, even they've paid for their inventory. So again, these are indicators, present obligation to pay. Yes, okay, maybe they have physical possession, but maybe they have legal title. Like if there's a fire, whose insurance is paying in this scenario? And maybe the contract is very specific around that. It's an interesting thing and it's nuanced. And in these moments, these are the ones where I'm like, oh, maybe the SaaS world isn't so bad.
The biggest challenges I've seen is with the resellers, which we talked about. And then also there's confusion I see between a free period and a free trial. Have you added time to your service term, or have you given the customer the right to decide whether they want to continue with the service? So in one, they probably have a present obligation to pay. They probably are getting the risks and rewards of ownership. In the free trial, maybe they don't have a present obligation to pay unless they either continue the service or opt out or opt in. Many times you have to opt in and have accepted it. That's a nuanced conversation that I've had with a lot of people, is differentiating that free trial versus free period. And it comes down to this control.
And what does the contract say? What is the business practice? What does the customer expect? Ideally, all those three things align. I think it's important to ask all of those questions because sometimes they don't align. And as much as we want to rely on what's in the contract, that's only one piece of the puzzle. What's actually happening in substance?
This concludes our episode. Stay tuned bi-weekly as we talk all things revenue recognition. You can be notified of new episodes and other information by following us on LinkedIn. Feedback and topic suggestions are always welcome through LinkedIn or by emailing us at revrecgals@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. The examples discussed are based on specific company dynamics. Check in with your auditors before making changes to your current processes. Specializing in revenue recognition may result in employment for life. Please consult your friends and family before pursuing this career.